So Apple is getting sued for having monopoly power in the mobile phone space and then kind of like using that power. Let's take a look.
Apple illegally maintains a monopoly over smartphones by selectively imposing contractual restrictions on and withholding critical access points from developers.
This really feels like in a slightly overly optimistic kind of like libbed up film where bad things happen to the baddies at the end. I don't feel like this kind of thing happens. This is a fascinating moment in terms of some of the ways in which politics, particularly in the US, and for all the flaws of Starmerism we might see a bit of in the UK, whereby governments are becoming that little bit more activisty, which is particularly helpful if we want to do anything about the climate. But tech companies in particular have got away with a lot of stuff for a very long time, and this is going to be really interesting. I don't know if this was like super duper duper recently, that Meta wanted to buy Giphy, I think. So Facebook, Meta were going to buy Giphy. I guess maybe, does Giphy own the library of GIFs? Like, I'm intrigued as to what you're buying if you're buying Giphy. It's not like user-generated content. It's kind of like corporate-generated content, which is kind of dystopian in a slightly different way, it feels. This is sort of various kind of TV production companies telling us what our cultural references should be, I guess. But essentially, the UK Competition and Markets Authority, the CMA, stepped in and kind of said, you can't do that. It's worth saying, Facebook also owns Instagram, and I guess maybe WhatsApp is probably as important a destination for this kind of thing. The CMA basically said you can't do that. You already own all of this stuff. If you also own Giphy, that's going to just extend the monopoly power that you currently have in the social media and communications marketplace. And so eventually what happened is they resold the company on because it was clear that the UK weren't going to let them do it. All of these kind of interventions, whether it's into the tech space or whether it's into other industries, are really fascinating these days from the point of view that we live in this incredibly globalized world. Another recent example is and we talked about this on stream the other day, the Adobe Figma case, where again, recently, this was the UK and the EU this time. Adobe was going to buy Figma, which is this app that's used for user interface design. And similarly, the UK and the EU stepped in and went, no, we don't think you should be able to do that. If Figma is also a part of the Creative Cloud package, the Creative Cloud is basically going to become a thing that any even vaguely creative company, and probably just like most companies in the world, that's just going to become like a tax that everyone just has to pay to Adobe. But one of the kind of interesting things about all of these things is that, we live in such a globalized world that it only takes one jurisdiction to step in, and it has ramifications for everyone all over the world, right? It only takes the UK to step in and say, Meta can't buy Giphy. That affects people in the US, it affects people in Europe. US lawmakers did not have to step in and stop Adobe buying Figma, but there are still ramifications for Adobe and Figma in the US, even though it was a different country that stepped in. The same will be true of TikTok. If ByteDance sell TikTok to a US owner, that would have impacts for TikTok users everywhere, right? Yeah, you have to be a significant enough market that the company won't just call your bluff. If a much, 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 much smaller country tried to pull off a similar thing, they maybe wouldn't get away with it. What is the smallest economy or country that they would do that with? Apple has always argued that with iPhones, it's easier for users if it's really locked down. You can't install an app on an iPhone outside of the auspices of the App Store, and that severely limits how you can use this device, which you have paid a reasonable amount of money for from Apple. So on a user end, it means you are severely limited in what you can use this little computer thing for. But as Tao was saying, you can't make an app without paying Apple either, right? You have to sell the app through Apple. I think I'm right in saying if you have a free app, you don't have to pay them money to give it away, but you're possibly going to use their software to make it. Actually, I think a developer account might cost money. Apple charges a 30% commission on any apps that are sold through its app store, and then on any in-app transactions that are made within that, which that kind of 30% figure is about the same as like a physical video game shop. I think I'm right in saying, but obviously they're not doing as much on their end. When Microsoft had its famous antitrust monopoly lawsuit back in 2001, one of the kind of key things was Internet Explorer. Microsoft computers, Windows computers, came with Internet Explorer pre-installed, and if you wanted to install a different browser, you would have to use Internet Explorer to go to that website and download it. And that was possible. It was entirely possible to do that, but the antitrust case still succeeded because they went, might be possible, but are people going to do that? iPhone completely bans you from installing apps that aren't through its app store. Android lets you do that, but the big question is, like, if I suggested to my mum that she side-loaded an app, I don't think she would look at me incredibly puzzled, right? Most average users of an Android phone are going to use the Play Store because that's the whole phone is designed around that happening. So even though it is technically possible, it's not probable. Like, Google still uses its monopoly power to heavily encourage you to use its like proprietary app store, right? I think the Apple monopoly case and Google as well, and some other big tech companies, it's this really interesting moment because post the big Microsoft case back in 2001, when Microsoft got kind of taken to task for being a monopoly in the US, they won the case, and then basically Microsoft managed to kind of appeal it down. Initially, it was going to be that Microsoft was going to be broken up. Like, it was going to be this monopoly that was going to be broken up for being too powerful. And there was like a patch of time where governments went off doing that kind of thing, partly because tech was like the cool industry that was doing really well, that was driving the economy, right? If you look at the kind of like biggest stocks in like the S&P 500, you know, it's Microsoft, Apple, Nvidia, Amazon, Meta. Like, these are all big tech companies, big platform companies that use all of these same kind of tactics of vertical integration of software and hardware. And so like for a while it was massively against the interests, particularly of politicians in the US, to take action against them because they were the big like growth vectors within the economy. And we are starting to see that turn. Back in the 2000s, early 2010s maybe, people still thought of the tech industry as being like cool and disruptive, like Facebook and Twitter, and like all of these companies were thought of as really cool and innovative. And it would have probably been quite hard for politicians to crack down on some of these monopolistic practices, or back then kind of maybe emergent monopolistic practices, because people really liked those companies, and then they're going to vote people out, right, if they start taking on Apple. But that kind of has changed now. Big tech has been a phrase that we use, and that is broadly a negative, right?